Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome for the workshop meeting of the City Griffin Board of Commissioners, August 23, 2022. Thank y'all for your patience as we get going. First item is to discuss the concept of creating zoning language to allow tiny housing in the city of Griffin. Planning and Development Director Chad Jacobs will address. Good morning, sir. Welcome.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How y'all doing?
Very good.
Pull up. There's a brief little presentation. Okay, so tiny housing. We're starting to get a number of different inquiries, kind of ebbs and flows a little bit, but this is something that I don't think is going to go away, and we need to kind of take a look at, and we need to get some direction from y'all how you'd like to proceed. So, all right, so a little research with DCA. They define tiny housing as a single family home, generally 400 square feet or less, and that excludes lofts. They also have four types of tiny homes, which are recreational vehicles, so obviously RVs, manufactured homes, residential or industrialized buildings. So oftentimes folks kind of get manufactured and industrialized buildings confused sometimes. And then site-built dwellings. A lot of what I would like to focus on today would be on the site-built dwelling portion of this. This is a development up in Clarkston. It's 8 cottages. They're less than 500 square feet each. They have high-end furnishings, and these homes sold between $118,000 and $200,000. Now, obviously, this is kind of in the immediate Atlanta metro area, of which we are a part of. Not to say that we can do tiny homes, kind of in the same price range, but I kind of want to give you guys an idea of kind of how they can be done. So this was probably the first one in the state that really took off and kind of has done well outside of the city proper of Atlanta.
So how many are we gonna have on an acre of land?
Don't know. That's what I'm hoping to get some input from y'all, see kind of where y'all want to go right now. Yes, sir. So good question. So we were approached by a local builder developer who actually, probably one of the most serious conversations that we had about tiny housing, and met with the housing authority, Mr. Dole, and they are looking at property at the corner of Booker Street and Scale Street. There's a number of tracts there. There's 4 tracts that the housing authority has. One of them is a land bank property, and all of those combined together is roughly about 1.89 acres total. And what they're proposing is roughly about 15 units, which would come out to be roughly a density of about 8 units to the acre, to your point, Commissioner Brock. So, and what they're proposing is a retirement cottage, roughly about 520 heated square feet. It's about 22 feet 8 inches wide by 28, 8 inches deep. 6 feet of that is a front porch, as you can kind of see on the plan that's in front of you there. So this is actually kind of what kicked off a big portion of this conversation. So currently in our Unified Development Ordinance, I kind of want to give you guys a little bit of context of what we have before we kind of talk about where we might want to go. Medium density residential has a 1,500 heated square foot requirement on a quarter-acre lot minimum. PRD, which is our planned residential development, has a 1,350 heated square foot requirement for residential detached. And then single family attached, kind of maybe think of it like in terms of like a condominium or something along those lines. There's 800 square foot minimum for 1 bedrooms, 950 for 2 bedrooms, and 1,100 square feet for 3 bedrooms. So in an attached setting, the smallest that we currently allowed under our code is 800 square feet heated. So obviously we have nothing within our language as it sits right now that would accommodate for any type of tiny housing. So, and actually I have a question there about density cap, which should actually be on this slide here. So here's kind of where we come to y'all and ask, is this a development option that we would like to kind of pursue? And if so, how? One of the ideas that we had in the conversations that we had with the developer and Mr. Dahl as it relates to the property there at Scales and Booker was maybe we kind of start to approach this from a 55 and older standpoint. We would obviously need to kind of research some legalities with that. I believe, and hopefully I don't misspeak here, and Ms. Carden and Mr. Connor can correct me if I misspeak here, but that's one of the areas that you actually can legally discriminate under the Fair Housing Act because it does allow for, an age restriction. To me, I think that might be the probably the best way to start this and kind of see. We need to be very, very careful with tiny housing. So it's something that could get out of hand if we don't do it right. And if we don't kind of have the proper controls on it. So that's really why we wanted to come before y'all today and kind of see if this was something that you wanted to entertain. I would definitely recommend a density cap on this to kind of give you a point of reference. Within our PRD district, there's a minimum of 16 or an allowance of 16 units to the acre on that. So obviously here we were just talking about an 8 units to the acre. To kind of give you a little bit of reference in that regard. But before we sit down and start kind of writing some language to this, we just kind of want to get a feel from y'all as to, would you like to kind of go down this path?
Ms. Ward, you want to start?
Yeah, okay. The area you're talking about, it's already zoned PRD, right?
It's correct. I think it's HDR A.
Okay, so would it have to be rezoned?
Well, it would depend on largely, this is kind of where we have a little bit of an advantage here that we don't have any code right now, so we can write code to accommodate it how we would like and to regulate it how we would like. So if we wanted to include it within the HDRA or the HDRB as an option, we can kind of write the code to do that, and it wouldn't require rezoning. Or we write a new tiny house district.
Okay.
So we've got a little bit of flexibility here.
So if this happens to occur, and then somebody else wants to do a tiny house development
Mhm.
in another area,
Mhm.
how, would it have to be rezoned? How would that work?
So it would be subject to the code of whatever we write. So let's say if we insert them in the HDRA or the HDRB language, and then somebody would like to do one in an area that's zoned MDR, they would have to apply for a rezoning. Or if we write a completely, wholly separate zoning code for, I don't know, TH, tiny housing, just using a rough example here, then everybody would have to apply to rezone. So that's kind of where we need to make a decision. Do we want to include it within the context of what we already have or write a completely different code section and kind of start from scratch and then create language therein? So to give you an example, like when the county brought in, with Sun City, and that's a 55 and older community, that was brand new language that was written, AAR, active adult residential, and so specific language that was tied to that type of development.
They don't have tiny houses out there, do they? What's the-
No, and the smallest that they can do out there, I want to say it's 1,100, if I remember.
But if you did, I guess, if you try to start saying rezoning, or we go, it's almost like a spot rezoning if we start trying to say.
No, sir. So it would be, we would keep it in an area that's already planned residential.
Right.
So all that we're just
So what I'm
essentially
thinking,
talking.
with planned residential development, there's smaller properties, so is it better to put it in a PRD zoning category, or is it, really, it's not HDR if it's.
In my opinion,
It's
the way that we would need to
HDR.
go with this would be if we stick it in any zoning category, we make it at the very least a special use, so that way we review them on a case-by-case
That's what I'm
basis,
wondering, how
and
do
then
you do
you
that?
apply a specific criteria to that, or you create a brand new district.
Because we spent a lot of money moving shotgun houses.
Yes, sir.
And so you look at like
Yes, sir.
Edgewood Avenue, we got rid of all those, and then you come back in, and those houses were probably 500 to 600 square feet at the time.
Yep.
We don't want to potentially create the future slum.
I understand.
And that's
what I said.
that's the balance I'm trying to figure out. How do we?
It's a tricky thing for us to kind of navigate right now. So, but that's why we kind of want to get a little kind of get a feeling from y'all, how you feel about these things before we start to try to write code.
She's on Zoom.
Yes, is he?
Ms. Flowers, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Would you like to make a comment?
Okay. Yes, I had a question
ahead.
in regards to this type of development. Are these managed properties or are they individually sold, or does it work like a subdivision?
The current proposal that we have would operate somewhat like a condominium complex. And would be rentals.
But there would be some group or some agency that had management oversight? Or
Like a rental
I guess I'm wondering if because we're asking about like outlining a specific tract for development and then kind of having this cohesiveness that's very different from everything else that's around it. I think my concern is how do we manage the actual property, because it is a novelty? Or are we supposed to look at it just like traditional housing? It's just that it's small.
Well, these are all great questions, and this is stuff that we would need to kind of research and kind of get a better feel for.
So the Clarkston development, it looks like it's a fee simple ownership
It is.
development. And maybe if we can look at what their ordinance is in terms of how they put it in their zoning and how they phrased it, and if there's another community that is written, just to try to compare some different areas. I think Statesboro may have had some possible tiny houses that they put in their area.
Dillon, Georgia has some.
Dillon. Yeah, I mean,
Clayton, Georgia does too, but they serve more downtown in their downtown district.
So I
trying
think
to
kind of the
where
balance.
zoning is, because right now, if you tied it into HDR, there's a lot of HDR area, and
There
does that fit into our redevelopment? We're about to do the North Hill Street redevelopment plan. How does all this fit into where we want to go?
Well, and I think that's kind of where we would have to structure it in terms of the regulations that we would put to it. Minimum acreage requirements, things of that nature. A lot of the HDR that we have currently right now, especially on the north side, it's in existing developed areas at 10th acre lots, things of that nature. So if we put, I don't know, you need to have a minimum 5, 8 acres, I don't know, just kind of spitballing right now, then that would kind of put a lot of those existing 10th acre lot tracks kind of off the table. And because I would leave those alone anyways, because they would be subject to infill development. So kind of what you already have out there right now, there already is a kind of a flexible development process there. So this is kind of where we're looking at, again, like, and this is almost like a 2 acre kind of combination of tracks. So
Planned residential development.
Yeah,
those
sure.
things.
So-
I mean, I can see where a doctor that lives in a different community, is working in small regional, needs a little small place just to crash.
so it's a number of
So
issues.
there's those types of, or it could be someone that has 2 different office locations.
Or it could be where a
Could be.
landlord comes in and just build a whole bunch of these, and we end up with a situation like we had on Edgewood and
Absolutely.
other places throughout our city.
It's a definite concern.
That is really a major concern of mine, that we're not building a smaller shotgun house.
Right.
And it's that, when I think of this tiny houses, if it's maybe the development they have at Housing Authority on Meriwether Street. Now, if they took a portion of that and if they wanted to explore tiny housing in an area 55 and older, it's a gated community.
Yes, sir.
That for me would be a great start.
I agree.
If we're going to look at this, that you put it in an area that has mixed housing. They have the apartment, the complex, and they have the houses over there. And if they want to take a portion of that, or we will take a portion of that to try to explore tiny houses that way, I think that would be be a better start than to see tiny houses going back up on Edgewood, tiny houses going up on North Hill Street. And
Or Booker Street,
Or Booker
which
Street.
was shotgun houses that were tied
Right.
up with Raceway.
yeah, that kind of stuff.
Well, and I think that's kind of why we're kind of pitching the idea of 55 and older as well. And with this being at Booker, it is housing authority property, because we're trying to kind of balance, obviously, those concerns. That's first and foremost on our mind, along with the issues that we're having with affordable housing and having conversations with Mr. Dahl. One of the big issues that they have is obviously for senior housing. So a lot of what they're experiencing at the housing authority is senior housing. So that's why I think that if we're going to kind of put our toe in the water on this, that would be really the best way to do it. I have very serious concerns with just kind of doing this wide open. So we need to be very, very careful how we do this. But it's balancing that affordable housing issue that we have and with seniors on fixed incomes and stuff like that. So I think that I think it's worth exploring to kind of see if we can kind of create something. And we can't.
Can we cautiously or look at see what's out there in terms of what's with these other communities?
This is purely just
find out what the other ordinances are doing.
This is purely just trying to feel out and kind of get an idea. Like we aren't committed one way or the other right now in terms of that's why we're coming to you just kind of with generalities to kind of get an idea for how y'all feel. So that way we can then start kind of researching more specific code to bring to y'all and see what you like and what you don't like.
Or would we rather just kill the whole idea? So
I think it's well worth researching, because not only the 55 and older, but looking at TV sometimes with the different programming. And there's a lot of young folks that are building small, tiny houses, 400 square foot or less. In communities. Maybe it's gotta fit the shoe. It's gotta fit what we're putting it in. And just to put it in any area, I don't think that's gonna fly.
Sure.
And I think we're gonna have to do a lot of research before we decide, is it gonna be certain areas we can do it in? Each of those areas like that, I don't know whether it fits or not. Right now, I'd say no.
Kind of a question or statement. I know that the development on Meriwether is 3 different sections, but that was all housing authority property.
Yes, ma'am.
So since the development over in the park and all of the property there is housing authority property, could that just be another part of that and under the same rules? And I know I think all of them now are basic market rate, and that the housing authority might have a few units. So it's mostly market rate, and it's not a bunch of subsidy units in either one of these developments now.
I believe that those are all tax credit. I think they're all LIHTC that were done there. So obviously there's that benefit there, but there's no like Section 8 or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. So if that was the start, this would not be something that's open up to everybody who could come do codes and come up with something. But this would be just like another portion of the developments in that area, like they did in other.
Yes.
Subject to the same rules and regulations and everything.
It would be one of those things that if we go this route, I would strongly recommend that we kind of have some very specific criteria that's tied to it. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but I think the 55 and older is the best way to start and see kind of what successes or what we can kind of learn from it if we're going to go this route. And I think that kind of helps us with some of the affordable housing concerns that we have, but it doesn't expose us to some predatory issues.
About 5 years ago, whenever the last time Emma met in Las Vegas, the land use cure focused on tiny housing there. And they had a very diverse market. They had builders, that's all they did was build subdivisions of tiny houses. But the ones that seemed to be the most amenable to living in were on basically individual lots, probably about an 1/8 acre lot. And they had outdoor amenities. It had porches, patios, maybe even a swimming pool of some sort on the lot. And people didn't live just in the house itself. They actually lived on the property. But the climate out there was, conducive to that, where we don't really have that here in the southeast. I don't think. Might the beach community or something.
But if you end up having a 2-car parking spot, 20 by 20, it's 400 square feet, so your parking area, so you start looking at carports or you got a 400-500-foot house.
I think that's again why you
And that's
start
where you
with the
gotta
55 and older
design
thing, because again, it's, you're usually looking at a 1-bedroom kind of issue, 1 car, the idea here, so that's.
So how all that fits into the overall appearance, so it's just not concrete with a small lot, 2 cars parked in the front and then a house that's the same size as the,
So
how all that
we can research.
works into like a planned residential.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, ma'am, you may.
So, and I'm not sure where the verbiage comes from, but I know that there are restrictions in place currently that allow for so many people to occupy. Like if you have a 2-bedroom house, you can only have X amount of people staying in that property. How does a tiny house kind of fit into that same concept? Like, is there language that says because it's 500 square feet, you can only have X amount of bodies, but if it's 650 square feet, you can have more? Because I guess as we're talking about like development beyond the constraints of the housing authority, I'm wondering, how do we manage a family of 5 trying to move into a tiny house?
So if I can respond to that somewhat, we put into our code several years ago a limitation on non-related persons living together using a formula that allocates like 2 to a bedroom, I believe it was. And each bedroom had to be a certain minimum square footage. But as far as a family unit, if you have 10 people in your family and you're all related by blood, marriage, and other legal relationship, you can have as many people living in that house as as exist.
Okay, so as we, and I understand that, and that's why I asked. So for me personally, as we explore the possibility of this going forward, I am concerned that a family of 7 would try to live in a tiny house. Certainly a family's prerogative if they decide that they want to all sleep on top of each other. But I think for me, I would want us to be mindful of the conditions that we could possibly be creating if we don't somehow address that it's only 500 square feet. There has to be a reasonable expectation of how many people can live in that space.
So the consensus for us is to let staff go ahead and continue researching this.
We can research and bring some
back
code to y'all.
ideas, and let's look at what other communities, how they're looking at it. And do our own personal research. We can look at if there's something, a community maybe a little closer to Clarkston, that you can get those addresses for us, and maybe through our own free time, we can take that opportunity to drive through and look at them and try to see if it's something that's a concept that we want to consider. Does that sound fair to everybody? Okay.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Moving to the next item is to discuss the regulations of group personal care homes within the Unified Development Code. Again, Planning Development Director Chad Jacobs will address.
So this group in personal care homes is actually one of our 2022 citywide goals, looking at addressing these. So as I'm sure y'all are all aware, we've kind of had some issues with these pop up recently, where we've been dealing with some illegal care homes and that haven't been run probably in the best nature. So it's really important that we kind of take a look at this and get a feel from you guys to see if we want to write some additional regs for this. So to give you a little bit of context, I thought it was kind of important to give you some of our current definitions that we have as it kind of relates to these. before we kind of start talking about where we may want to go. So currently, a boarding home is a dwelling other than a hotel where for compensation and by prearrangement for a definite period where meals and or lodging are provided for 4 or more persons. So again, boarding home. The next definition that we have is a group home for disabled persons. So a residential use or facility located in a single-family dwelling where non-related persons, and this is key, with a disability recognized by the Americans with Disabilities Act may live together in a residential setting free from discrimination and local government rules, policies, practices, or services except as would constitute a direct threat to the health, safety of the occupants or other individuals. Again, that's a group home for disabled persons. Next, we have a personal care home. A residential use or facility located in single-family dwelling or operate for a profit or not, which undertakes through its ownership or management for compensation to provide personal services, protective care, and oversight. And again, this is key, of ambulatory, non-related persons who need monitored environment, but who don't have injuries or disabilities which require chronic or convalescent care. So these homes may include facilities which monitor residents' daily function and location and have, again, key capability for crisis intervention. And then such terms do not include old age residences, board facilities, which we just kind of went over in the boarding home definition, and then the group home for disabled persons, which we went over second. So those are our current definitions for group and personal care homes. We don't have a definition for group homes. So there's a number of different layers to these things. And so all that we really have is a lot of kind of what we see is really going to be tied to that personal care home kind of definition of what we've been seeing lately that's been operating illegally. I laid on the days for you section 503E. I apologize, I should have included this in the slide. But got a little overzealous and forgot about it. And so 503E is key here. These are what little requirements that we do have for a personal care home. And I want you to kind of pay attention to the definition of this because it says each personal care home, boarding home, or group home having 6 or more persons shall be subject to the following requirement. And again, this is for 6 or more persons. So they're subject to all regulated facilities shall comply with the state regulation and acquire applicable state licenses for operation. All facilities must register with the Department of Community Development and provide a copy of all state licenses and documentation. The exterior appearance of any residential structure for which a personal care home, boarding home, or group home is approved shall be maintained as a residential structure and no signs other than a sign attached to the primary structure not exceeding 2 square feet shall be erected. Shall meet all regulations as identified in the adopted building code and adopted fire code, meet all parking standards as identified within section 6.32, and all facilities must apply for and receive a City of Griffin business license, or as we refer to those as occupational tax certificate or OTC. So
supplemental sheet on those things.
So those are as they relate to 6 or more persons. So we currently allow boarding homes, group homes, and personal care homes as permitted uses essentially within all of our zoning districts. And we kind of break those down as 5 or less, which are not subject to the 503E regulations that we just went over, and then 6 or more, which are subject to those. And so the way that I've broken these down is obviously the first bullet point is all of our single family residential, LDR A, B, and C, and then MDR. Then the next bullet point is HDR A and B, and PRD. Those are more of like our high density type residential developments. Then you have your commercial zoning districts, institutional, industrial, and then actually conservation subdivisions allowed. So we currently basically allow them across the board as a matter of right. With the only requirements being that where there's 6 or more, they have to basically apply for an OTC and show proof of your state licensing. So that's all that we have right now.
You said they have to have a sign?
They can have a sign, but it can be no more than 2 square feet.
Okay.
So
On the property, on the structure.
Okay, all right.
You won't find any of
I was
those.
gonna
So-
say,
Yeah, you're not gonna find any of those.
Is the 5 or less a state requirement based on fair housing standards, or is that just an arbitrary number that we put in?
That's a great question.
So I guess we need to find out what,
I'm not I'm pretty sure it's not in the federal fair housing law. I don't know if the state personal care home regulations with the Department of now Community Health, is that right? Behavioral health. I don't know if they-
so these 6.
And that's what's found on
So
our,
are these 6 items state regulations, or these are ordinance regulations?
I honestly don't know.
And how does that, so I'm trying to figure out how does that relate in terms of what the state requires fair housing in terms of that number?
Yes, sir. So that's,
You recall, we had a fair housing
Right, that's-
complaint against us. It never ripened into a full lawsuit. We mediated it with the Department of Justice. And some of these regulations, we changed some stuff at that time. It's been, what, maybe 10 years ago now? But what we have today in our code is basically what we agreed to in that. It's in order.
yes.
Chad, I was looking at all of the zoning districts where they are allowed, and just without having something to compare it to, are there any zonings that are restricted from personal agreements?
No, ma'am.
So
That was part of the consent of the Department of Justice.
Chad, when you first started, like you said, I remember you said something about 4 or less. Something you said about 4, having 4 people.
5 or less. So we break it up on
So
our,
if it's 5 or less, you don't have to meet these requirements.
the way that I read this, no, ma'am. So, which that's a big red flag, for me. So the way that it's on our permitted use chart that we have, like when you look at all of our zoning districts, tell you, like in a commercial business district, you can do retail services or a car wash or a bank or something along those lines. And then it'll tell you, is it allowed as a permitted use, which is by right, or a special use, where they got to come before y'all and get approval for that on a case-by-case basis.
So personal care homes are allowed in every
Yes, ma'am.
district across the board.
Yes, ma'am.
And if I decided I want to do a personal care home in an apartment, and I said I had less than 5 people,
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not subject to any of these rules.
The way that I read it,
Or you could put it in a central business district, take a building and cut it up into 5 bedrooms and
You
have
got it.
5 people in it,
you got it,
and there's no control.
you got it.
And I don't have-
That's why we-
Would our, like our central business district, not allowing ground floor residential occupancy, could you then?
So that's why I got on there, how to address CBD. To me, the CBD is kind of a wild card. That's gonna be the biggest, kind of like a big concern that we have. So that's kind of why, why we're wanting to come to you guys and kind of get a little bit of direction. Should we regulate and how? Allow these in single-family residential districts with approval of a special use permit. That would be my recommendation of how to kind of move with this.
Say it again.
So we allow them in single-family districts like LDR A, B, C, and MDR, but they would need to get a special use permit. And then we tie some criteria to that, so then they come to y'all and ask for a special use permit to operate the care home.
But keep in mind that the underlying purpose of the Fair Housing Act, Federal Fair Housing Act, was to mainstream people with disabilities so they could live in a normal family setting in a single-family home.
Yep.
Whether it was in a single-family district or in a family or a commercial district. If it's still a single-family home, the way they look at it, HUD level, is that, it's subject to holding a group home.
Sure.
Housing.
And I think that's why we need to look at both our definitions and kind of this, because that kind of to y'all's point, asking about apartments or, in the CBD or something along those lines, I think that would be, to your point, kind of some of the concern that we would have is, you're referencing the single family residential, but, we also have some concerns. We had an issue very recently, with a home that was in a single family residential. And then, if, apartments and stuff like that, is there an obligation on our part to make sure that these are being run safely and clean and things of that nature? So that's the conversation that we're having.
It regardless of how many people it was, they would have to comply with the road,
Regulations.
I would agree.
even if it was in an apartment, now, we can still have any control over where they are, and I have a problem with that, but they should be subject to
Sure.
people knowing that at least the city knowing that this is a person that came home, what, something happened if they in an apartment, and the people get, succumb to the fire, and we don't have any control over, we don't even know.
Some type of registration or something where you got,
So,
so say if they've got only 2 people.
Yeah.
And the owner disappears, and you have a problem, there should be some type of registry or some type of way to.
great segue. So we started kind of looking around at other communities, kind of seeing what other communities are kind of doing near us. So City of McDonough allows group homes, and they just reference group homes. And it's interesting because everybody's got slightly different definitions. I think we should probably tie our definitions to what the state is saying, and that's something that we can work with Kelsey and kind of and Drew and kind of get a feel for that. The City of McDonough allows group homes with the approval of a special use permit. And so here's some highlights that we even kind of brought in, and Michelle did some great research on this. So new group homes not allowed within 1,500 feet of an existing group home. So they've got a distance requirement, so that you can't put one within a certain distance of another one. No more than 2 residents may occupy a bedroom. That's City of McDonough. City of Noonan allows personal care homes in residential zoning districts with the approval of a special exception, which is our version of a special use permit. Facility must be operated out of the principal residence of the owner or operator, who shall also occupy the residence. Shall be a minimum of 1 full-time staff person during operating hours. At least 1 administrator or on-site manager or responsible staff person shall be on premise 24 hours per day. And then Spalding County, they allow them in residential zoning districts with the approval of a special exception. They tie the number of residents to the size of the house and the number of bathrooms. So actually, the bigger the house, the more bathrooms you have, the more residents that you could have, not to exceed 8 total in your largest house with maximum number of bedrooms. And then the owner or operator of the care home must domicile in the dwelling as well. And then also the way that they define theirs too is the clients, if you will, that are residing there, they're residents, and then whoever is domiciling there, like the owner, they're a resident as well. So if you're allowed 8, and say it's you and your child, well, that's 2. You're only allowed 6 clients. That's kind of how that breaks down. So that's kind of to give you an idea of kind of how some like surrounding communities are approaching this. So we thought it was kind of important to toss that out there. I'm a big advocate for going the special use option, but I'm open to any ideas, comments, so that way we can kind of start researching a little bit more and maybe potentially bring an ordinance to you guys that is kind of in the wheelhouse of what you're possibly
I'll be the
thinking.
first to say I like the special use because I think it gives us some form of control as to what, and put some regulations, put some teeth in what it is we're doing. That way we will know that it's being operated. I think that's the main thing. Anybody that's doing it, we know they are, that we know that they are out there.
Yes, sir.
5 and under needs to be a limit. I mean, it's if you're running a business to be paid for. Do we have a grasp on how many group homes we have? Or
That are on the
that 5
record?
and under? And how do we address those that we aren't aware of, or we don't?
And along his question, when someone has a group home, do they necessarily have to register with the state to have a group home?
So we, like
So
when they
does
get their
does their
OTC,
registry match our registry? Okay, and that's,
And that's part of one of the issues that we're dealing with here is kind of addressing, those that aren't registered with us. To me, by adding some criteria like this just gives us additional teeth in the enforcement process. If we have no record of it, the state has no record of it, we can enter into, a citation process that has some legal, they're in violation of this and this and this, never came and got a special use, no documentation with the state.
Or occupation, could we like set it up with the occupational tax for by
Have
January
to.
1?
Have to.
You have to register with the occupational.
So we do have some that are registered, that do have an OTC with us, but there's a bunch of them out there that don't. So, and we're having to address those as we find them.
When we say group homes, is there, like a loophole for maybe a different description on a group? Like, per se, juvenile, I guess, kids in the law enforcement, they're caught up in the program and whatnot. There's a couple of homes that I know about, and where do homes like that fit in?
It's another good question, and we would have to look at that holistically with this as well. In addition to group personal care homes, boarding homes, halfway houses, so.
most of these juveniles are technically on federal.
And would those necessarily fit into any type of verbiage that we try to adopt, or is there, yes? So I'm just trying to get my head around group home, who is involved or who is excluded, and what the legality.
And that's why I think it's important for us to look at our definitions that we have right now. There's probably a little bit of disconnect in those definitions.
So I do want to address that when we were initially looking at this, when we did have some of our issues come up with the definitions, aside from the 3 that Chad has listed, there was also a nursing home, I believe a convalescent home was a separate one. So there's a lot of other designations that are used less often. But what's interesting is a lot of those definitions use terms like group home to describe the service that they're offering. So that allows for a built-in loophole where if you don't like the standards for the 5 or more listed under, group home or personal care, you can fall under a completely different designation and completely circumvent our rules. So this is going to really have to start with getting these definitions under control going forward. Those definitions are also, as far as the question with the 5 or more persons, a lot of this may be taken from the fire code. My personal recommendation would be more reliance on fire code from a nuisance perspective and from the cases we've dealt with. What I realize is the fire code provides the only teeth that the city has with regards to regulating them as of right now. So rather than even look at the UDC, the first thing I'm looking at is the fire code to figure out how to get the places that are treating people poorly and not managing their operations correctly shut down, because that really is our only resource. So this would bring all that together and create something where we can make sure that people are safe and that these things are being operated properly. But it does start with the definitions.
Can we, right now, fire marshal goes out and inspects businesses on an annual basis. Can we actually get that where? Is there?
Yes, but part of the issue is going to be requiring some sort of mechanism for us to identify where they are.
A registry.
Yes, a registry, because as of right now, it's when we get a complaint or if we have EMS go out to a particular call, I'm notified and we start having to scramble to make sure that we're getting the right parties out there to inspect and make sure that facility is being ran properly. But I will admit, when I look at our UDC definitions, I have concerns about our enforcement power, even with regard to fire, because if it's residential or if it's simply rental property, we're restricted by state law. So, all of those things are going to be questions we have to answer going forward.
Okay, any other questions on this? Looks like we got a good bit of work to do. Look forward to recommendations. Moving in to discuss staff recommendation for the future Griffin Spalding County Land Bank Authority. City Manager Jessica O'Connor will address.
Good morning. All right, I think we got, there we go. Let's get another presentation for you. There's a lot of words in this presentation that I'm not going to dwell too much on because you should be familiar with it, but it's more of a reminder is where we currently are before I wanted to make recommendations where I think we need to go. So most of you remember that the Griffin Spalding County Land Bank was established in 2008 under the previous Land Bank Act, and their purpose was to acquire tax delinquent properties in order to get them back into a tax generating state. They were supposed to do that to provide affordable housing, new trade, commerce, industry, and employment opportunities for the citizens. In that IGA that was agreed upon between the city and county, it also required the land bank to inventory, organize, and classify properties based on the suitability of use. They could extinguish past due tax liens that were filed by the governing authorities, and the governing board consisted of 5 members, and this is actually a recent change from 2020, but 2 appointed by the city board of commissioners and 2 appointed by the county board of commissioners, and then 1 joint appointment is either supposed to be a school board member or an administrative employee. That person right now, of course, is Bruce Ballard. So the current land bank authority acquires property through donation, purchase, acceptance of tax asset, or acceptance of asset forfeiture property, and then the judicial interim tax foreclosure. Also, the one that is most common for us is a bid at tax sale. So we can dispose of property currently through selling, trading, exchanging, or giving it away with the following priority considerations: to neighborhood nonprofits or governmental entities for low-income housing, to other entities for new or rehabbed low to mod income housing, or to persons, neighborhood nonprofits or governmental agencies to promote trade, commerce, and industry, especially those that would create new employment opportunities. That's a pretty much commercial venture. And this is supposed to be in that order. So first would be to nonprofits or governmental entities for low income housing. Then you could do new or rehab low to mod income housing, and then commercial disposition. It does not preclude the land bank from banking properties, assembling tracts so that they can have community redevelopment or other public purposes like maybe a park or green space that they see fit. The disbursement of sales proceeds currently is to the land bank to recover its expenses, then to the city, county, and school in proportion to and to the extent of their respective tax bills and costs. So just very simple math. If they sold a property for $1,000 and they had more than $1,000 in expenses, they're going to keep it all. If they sold a property for $5,000, only had $1,000 in expenses, they're going to keep that $1,000, and the $4,000 will be split based on the tax rate of the 3 governing bodies. Then to the land bank to further its operations, and then to the county and city in such proportions as the parties may agree based on the percentage of contributions by each party. Right now, the land bank is split at 50-50 for the expenses that they budget. So the city pays 50%, the county pays 50%. Current provisions for staffing and budget. They currently have a part-time executive director position that is vacant, which is elected by the land bank board. They set the terms and conditions, including the salary and benefits. The city and county staff may provide additional staff resources to assist in any kind of execution of duties and responsibilities. The land bank may hire outside consultants if they have such approved in their budget, which is also approved by the city and county during our budget. The land bank board sets that budget. We ask for that by January 1st, and then we apportion it again based on reasonable principles of tax equity to avoid double taxation. That should all sound very familiar to you right now because of service delivery strategy. You have heard me say that I do not agree that 50-50 is a reasonable split of tax equity to avoid double taxation, but that's a conversation for a different day. Then, of course, the chief administrative officer of the land bank is the treasurer, and that person shall maintain a set of books and records for the auditor, and they shall be audited annually. We did find out that wasn't taking place until recently, but we do have a most recent audit from the land bank. The duration and termination of the agreement, it's a 1-year term which automatically renewed on January 1st and renews automatically on an annual basis at that time unless the city or county gives 90 days written notice to the other party that they want to terminate. And then upon dissolution, the way that it is worded now, any property remaining shall be distributed pro rata, so 50-50, according to its appraised value to the parties. Or if it was donated, we're supposed to make some kind of effort to find the party that donated it and ask if they want it back. In our case, I think most of the time that's going to be a no because it was donated to the land bank because we had some kind of issue with it for nuisance purposes, and so they didn't want it anymore, and so that's fine, donate it. But we would, based on the way that the agreement is currently written, have to make an effort to ask that donated party if they want it transferred back to them. So as you'll all remember, we hired KB Advisory Group as our consultants to do a review of the current operations and structure of the land bank. Some of the key takeaways that they shared with us is that the land bank has about just right under 400 properties in inventory, but 85% of those properties have unclear title, which is a big problem. Other land banks in similar size jurisdictions have 8 to 20 properties. I think we are like the third biggest land bank in the state. The current land bank does not have funding or staffing to manage, maintain, and market that many properties. A part-time executive director is not sufficient to operate it successfully. Other communities use a combination of staff from departments that deal with housing or land use. So you would have the planning department or the community development department help, or housing authorities. We do that very just sort of every day anyway. But this is very specific that sometimes is looked at as a staffing model. Operating without procedural guidelines to steer strategic decision-making for property acquisition, holding, and sale. That goes back from quite some time, where any property that was not bid upon at a tax sale, the land bank was acquiring without any kind of sort of strategic plan for that property, and which is why we have a couple retention ponds and playgrounds within the inventory. It is not self-sufficient with the current funding mechanisms. It's budgeted only by city and county, and then revenue from their property sales. It is undermining owner occupancy restrictive covenants because we have not enforced those and gone back and filed any kind of lawsuit if they have rented them. However, it does have a very successful side lot program, which other land banks are interested in pursuing as well.
Let me ask you a question. How do other land banks, because obviously if you go to tax sale, you have no idea what you're getting as far as state, or how do they end up with clear titles? Or why are we so disparate?
I think a lot of, well, first of all, a lot of them don't acquire that much property. So they're able to get those titles cleared quicker, more efficiently after their 12-month right of redemption. A lot of them use judicial and RIM tax foreclosure processes, which means that everybody has been notified ahead of time. So once it's sold at that tax sale, it is free and clear. Our county doesn't really do that. We have them every once in a while, and Stephanie's probably the better person to speak on that, but they're not as common as in other counties. So ours are just mainly tax sales, knowing that we're going to have that 12-year right of redemption run, and then also the advertisement. So I think, when you're looking at 85% of 400 versus potentially 85% of 10, you have 8 to deal with instead of however much 85% of 400 is. So, all right. So we have a couple of recommendations as staff. As I mentioned in the agenda item, this actually needs to be a joint decision between the city and county. I can make recommendations all day, but until the county says, yes, we agree, we want to do that, the land bank has to actually be constituted by a county with a city. So a city cannot do one on its own. So these are my recommendations. I wanted to make sure that we were all in a consensus, so that if we have an opportunity to meet with the county, we can say this is where we are, and have maybe an IGA drafted for them to vote on as well. But we would like to reconstitute under the 2012 statute. If you'll remember in past conversations, that gave the land banks a little bit more authority, such as acquiring loans, grants, or bonds to pay for particular projects, entering into agreements with the federal government to use facilities or services of theirs. It gives them a little bit more authority to enter into partnerships or joint ventures or other collaborative relationships with public and private entities to own, manage, develop, and dispose of real property. We also are recommending that they hire a full-time executive director, which would be a city employee. In discussions with Dr. Ledbetter, we do feel like most of the properties that are owned by the land bank are within the city. We have a little bit stronger housing component to our staff and what we do through nuisance abatement and code enforcement. So it makes more sense for it to be a city employee rather than a county employee. But of course, that executive director would also report to the land bank board. So it would be set up similar to the airport authority and Mr. Mull, or the downtown development authority and Mr. Stratton, where they have that dual responsibility to me, but then also to the board of those authorities. We also are suggesting to appoint additional board members to ensure better coordination with local governing bodies and community-wide strategic plans. I'll say that this is probably where we've struggled the most to decide what we think will be best, because big boards sometimes have a hard time obtaining a quorum, but I still think that this is the best way to go. It would be the mayor or his designee, the planning director, so Mr. Jacobs, the county chair or his designee, the county community development director, of course, the school board member, the administrative employee, and then as it currently sits, the 2 city appointments and the 2 county appointments would still be made, each by the city and 2 by the county. So those are our recommendations. I have, again, talked with Dr. Ledbetter about these, but they have not yet had a meeting to see if they have a consensus from the 5 of theirs to proceed in this manner. But this is sort of where we are at this point, and I felt, just to put on the record, we have been operating as a staff, Michelle Haynes and Chad Jacobs and their entire office, as sort of the fill-in executive director for the land bank since about February. We cannot continue to do that. And so we have to make a decision. So I've already asked them if they get a call, just to take a message and let them know that we'll have to wait until we have a decision on the land bank, because it's not a city function right now, and we can't continue to operate it that way. We're not getting our own work done. So we really are in a hiatus at this point. We're not doing anything else.
How long, if we do have our government agreement to move forward with staff recommendations, what's the timeline in terms of this taking place?
Well, it is a little interesting. So when I was rereading the 2008 agreement, which is now sort of the 2020 agreement, there are some things that we would have to do, it looks like, to potentially dissolve that one to reconstitute this one. And then the statute that I read just this morning in regards to the 2012 Act gives us some provisions as well. So it's not as easy as just agreeing upon an IGA. So it's going to take a little bit of time. I would say maybe an October meeting would be where we could fall.
But that would be the effective date with October, or like January 1?
We can do whichever, but just realize that in the interim, there's
But I'm
no.
saying when could, in the 2012 version of this recommendation, you think by October it could be?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a January 1. It
Okay.
would just be that we would need to, at that time, make sure we appoint the board members and go from wherever y'all want to start, date-wise.
Ms. Ward?
When we first established the land bank, we hired a full-time director. And, okay, if you're saying the city, it would be a city employee, is that somebody that would, a new hire to do that job? Okay. Who would that person answer to? The board?
Me and the board. So it would be just like Mr. Mole, where it's at sort of the top of the organizational structure, where they have a dotted line to me and then also to the authority.
Okay, and the city would pay that person, it will be under city benefits and everything.
Right, but in this case, just like Mr. Mole, it is split through the budgetary process where we send the county a bill that they pay quarterly, do we know? Annually.
Because if I recall, the last time the city hired somebody, for the longest time, that person was not getting paid.
No, the land bank director has always been paid, hired by the land bank and paid out of the funds that you contribute to the land bank and the county contributes to the land bank. But they've always, keep in mind, the first person was a person with experience related to grants because y'all put NSP under the land bank. We had that for 4 years.
But that was a lot of times, I remember her name and her face because I remember her saying this.
And she had experience with grant programs, which was the reason she was hired.
The way that Mr. Mole and Mr. Stratton work, they are city employees, are subject to our personnel policy, but they do have responsibilities to the board. So on a day-to-day basis, Mr. Mole and Mr. Stratton are coming to my weekly staff meetings on Wednesday. I require a weekly report that's due on Mondays, and they have to do that. So their sort of day-to-day is mine, and they're subject to the city's personnel policy. They're paid just like a city employee. They have to do anything else that a city employee would be expected to do. But as far as what they do for policy and operations for their respective positions, it would be subject to what the land bank board said.
And for what it's worth, I agree with that recommendation completely.
It's kind of like CPA where.
Yeah, it's just like DDA.
Reports to our board, but he's also our employee.
I I keep using Mr. Mull because that's probably a little bit
Yeah.
better, because it is city and
Jointly
county.
funded.
But then also, if Mr. Stratton was not a DDA executive director, there is argument, he's still Main Street and Economic Development, which is a department of the city. So he's got more responsibility as a city employee than probably somebody that just is an authority that is jointly funded like the airport authority.
Like our DDA wouldn't get, I feel like, the funds and all the programs if it wasn't somebody who has access to all that.
Correct. And you have to remember too, I mean, what we're looking at from the land bank's perspective, they submit a budget of about $35,000 to $38,000 for each of us, the city and the county, to pay. But there's a lot of incidental expenses that are not charged. Just even this week, we had an open records request that if we were not handling the land bank, we wouldn't answer. But that's not, we're not charging the land bank for that. We're not charging the land bank for, you know, a lot of the financial assistance or just administrative assistance that has been given since February. And we never have, not when Ms. Church was doing it, not when Mr. Joyner was doing it. There's a lot of staff work for the city and the county, I'm sure, in the past that goes into it. So you're not gonna account for all of those funds just in what they request in budget. And it's automatic because it is a joint venture. IGA is set by the city and the county. There's going to be responsibilities on city staff and on county staff. We attend the meetings and always have. So it's not just the executive director that's fulfilling the roles that are needed in order to run a successful land bank. But for the last 14 years, it has needed more oversight than what has been able to be given. But no fault of the board, they're volunteers and they all have their own jobs. So I'm not suggesting that they've done anything wrong. My suggestion is that we need to say, this is who you report to day to day, and make sure that it's in line with what the land bank board is saying that they need to be doing. So it's almost more help for the land bank board to just make sure that their employees do it correctly.
Ms. Flower.
Yes, so the question,
Sorry, Cora.
Oh, one second, Cora, please.
Just looking at staff recommendations on that last bullet point,
Mhm.
the way the board is, I guess, the way they're selected, is that similar to the way it is now? That's
Yeah,
what I'm
you'd just be
thinking.
adding some staff and elected officials, which is allowed by law. So in 48-4104, which is the Georgia Land Bank Act from 2012 and have been or amended and readopted in May of 2017. It specifically says that notwithstanding any law to the contrary, an elected member of the municipal governing authority shall be eligible to serve as a board member. And then any municipal employee shall be eligible to serve as a board member, and then it says the same for the county.
So that takes care of the verbiage back when we were trying to designate how many people would be on the board. This gives us way more than the 5 or,
Yes, this would be 9.
oh, no.
So you'd have 2 elected and then, and an elected and employee from the city, an elected and an employee from the county, you have the school board person, and then you have your 2 city appointments. So we would do the same thing that we have always done and appoint 2, and the county would appoint 2.
That's like our health board. I mean, I started same format, just being consistent. across the
Airport
board.
Authority.
Airport authority is that way, and that's why we sort of looked at it.
I have a
Ms.
question.
Butler, let me get Cora, please. Cora, please go ahead.
yes, so I understand that in the recommendation is for us to have city personnel on the board. I'm wondering, I think my concern is how we address like strategic planning for what the city's goals are. I think because in the past we've had some experience where the board may have thought that it was functioning for some different goal or purpose, but we weren't able to interject. So how is that addressed going forward if we change our developmental goals and say, hey, you know, we want to do something else in this area, do we have any ability to address that?
I think that's exactly why you have that employee on the board. I mean, Chad's gonna be the one that's requesting that change with us, so he's gonna know, you know, he could take back to the land bank board next week. This is what we are talking about with tiny housing, so we'd like for you to acquire the rest of these properties on scales of Westbrook. You sort of build in that strategic plan with really not a lot of having, I mean, it's just sort of told that this is what we're doing, and so the discussion happens within that board membership rather than, I mean, I don't know that it really would translate much differently than what's happening now, except that Chad would have a vote instead of just sort of being there as staff. You could do it either way, and we have tossed that back and forth. We do believe that there at least needs to be an elected official or the employee on the board for each, the city and the county. Doesn't have to be both, but it just made it a 9-member board instead of 7. So that's sort of neither here nor there for me. I just think as long as you had one or the other, then I think that helps you with that strategic plan.
Could the land bank board, if we did come back and say that we were interested in the tiny housing development, something like that, could they theoretically, or in not theoretically, could they say, yeah, we're not interested in supporting that at all, so we won't do anything about that?
Yes, which they could do now. But we don't have, the land bank board does not have to agree with that. That's our zoning ordinance. They wouldn't have any authority to change what we wanted to do as a city. They would just not, I guess if they made that kind of decision, they would not be willing to help us acquire property like at tax sale. And then hold it so that taxes aren't paid on it, extinguish the tax liens, those kind of things that they are beneficial in doing. So if they chose not to proceed with us in that kind of manner, then we'd have to find another way to acquire property to be able to do that. If the city wanted to do that, otherwise it's just private development.
So if we take on an employee, do we no longer look at it as annual funding for the board? Or like how we have now, it is an annual decision to fund the board, but we're also not paying for an employee. So how is that impacted if we now have someone on staff? Sorry.
No, that's okay. Most of their budget is sort of personnel related. It's either personnel benefit, salary, or operating supplies for that personnel. Then of course, we're going to have the line item for legal fees, the auditor's fees, that kind of thing, which we are paying for. That would not go away as having an employee because we still need to do that. We still need to foreclose to redeem. We still need to be able to close properties. So it's just a contracted service. And it's divided out sort of that way in the land bank's budget. As far as the city's budget is concerned, it's just as a payment to the land bank authority. But we do have that delineated request from the land bank every year.
Do we retain the same powers that we have now for dissolution in the future?
We can. That would be part of the IGA.
Okay, well, yeah, and certainly not because I'm leaning towards, I'm in favor of the recommendation, so I don't have any issues with that, but I want to make sure that because we're attempting to change the structure, that we're not also obligating ourselves to some 10 or 15 year commitment if we find shortly in the future that it's not living up to the expectations of what we thought it would be.
Right.
Okay, no more questions about that.
Thank you, Ms. Ward.
Do we have to go back to the General Assembly?
No.
Is David Lucky, is he an employee of the city or the county?
No.
And why
I
would?
don't think. Is he a county employee? He's not a county employee. No.
He's not, he's employed by the development.
Any other questions? So we're good to move forward with this recommendation and present it to the county and see if we can get an intergovernmental agreement and move forward. Is that yes, Ms. Ward?
Y'all take comments.
What was that?
Good luck. Good luck.
Okay.
So
I think we have to
y'all
guess.
take
Yes, sir,
comments in the
Mr. Galloway. Yes, sir.
Y'all take comments in the workshop.
From you, I will be more than glad to take your comments, Mr. Galloway, since you're the chairman of the
Special,
Land Bank
nothing
Authority.
special for me.
Let's talk about the executive director first. I support that executive, having done this since the inception and being close to reaching my vomit point with land bank. I support that employee, the executive director being employee of the city. And the reason is because as a volunteer person, none of the five of us have the ability to monitor day-to-day the performance of the executive director, compliance with their job requirements. And coupled with that, the reality is the largest expense of land bank is tied to that salary. Now, excuse me, Jessica is right. There will be other costs, there are other fees, there are other things that are attached to that have been hidden, both in the city taking on that cost, and then also, you know, we provided free space, free copier, free electricity when that office was in my building. That office will be moved to the housing authority, which is appropriate for it to go there. And keep in mind, the only reason it was in my office was by default. At the time it was created, there was no space in the city or the county for some place for it to be held. So I support that. I have concerns about immediately moving to the 2012 land bank statute. And here's the reason why. And I told Jessica that. If you can give us somebody as an executive director who moves these properties to foreclosure of the right of redemption on the properties, and we have 120 plus contracts pending on property that we cannot seemingly get closed. And we can move those to closing at that point, and when those tasks are done, it's appropriate to look at extension of the powers under the 2012 statute, in my opinion. That is our main problem. Over the past 5 years, we have closed approximately 90 properties, turned about 1.7 million back on the tax rolls, and produced tax revenue of about $25,000 to $30,000. And this is on properties that are being sold at $1,000, $1,500 a pop, or they're being transferred under the side lot program for free in order to get the lots consolidated. I do want to reiterate one thing Jessica said. We have a requirement. When we first started, we imposed this as a standard, but y'all put it as a requirement that any property that's going to be sold by land bank has to be owner occupied. So we put a deed restriction on those. We estimate that probably 20% of the properties that have been transferred thus far that have houses on them have now been converted back to rentals in violation of that deed restriction. Now, on the new formation, it is imperative that the city planning office and the county's planning office and the housing authority be involved. When Virginia came on, we gave express direction to coordinate with city, county, and housing authority. And we are presently holding certain properties in anticipation of housing authority development and city redevelopment. I can't give you a number on those, but they're being held. So it is imperative to have them there. The terms need to be staggered in whatever board you set up, so we don't start suddenly there's a fresh slate and then there's a dramatic change. I want to finally say that it is, y'all have to be prepared. The Land Bank Authority, I had hoped would be financially self-sufficient through property sales. It's not going to be. And it's not going to be because of the value of the properties we have. We're criticized for having X number of properties. Griffin has a very unique housing problem. And I don't believe other land bank authorities, as a general rule, encounter old shotgun houses on 10th acre lots. They go into foreclosure because they're no longer rented. I won't go into detail, but we had put everything on hiatus, but I had a call from somebody who is in the rental property business for us to accept a donated lot. Jessica can confirm that that means there's a piece of trash house on that property that they don't pay the demo. Okay, we don't take those. So from the standpoint of economic self-sufficiency from sales generation, we're not going to see that. And to some degree, I guess I need to apologize for being the problem child that caused this, because after being frustrated with what we were and weren't doing, I made the suggestion, well, let's just stop it. If we can't get the houses closed, just stop it. And so that prompted this study. It prompted Chad's office now getting complaints about one of the land banks not doing anything. But in the long run, it has served its purpose to force us to look at it and get it improved. And again, the key right now is not expansion of the power, not right now, but getting the properties we have under contract closed. And that has been the most frustrating thing I have dealt with, because I have been harping on that. I was harping on that with Virginia from the beginning of, before the pandemic. That's
Is that
all.
what we're
Thank you,
talking
sir.
about?
I'm sorry?
And you, is that what we're talking about the clear titles? What is the primary reason, what is the, I guess, the driver for?
This, in some respects, from a legal process, this is fairly a simple process. You go in, we don't get information on the title
Right.
at the tax sale. Stephanie can talk about the title issues too, but Sylvia doesn't give out information on the title. So for example, let's assume a property's owned, Sylvia's got the tax sale, I think, coming up in September. All right. What I hope had been happening, and I think it was, we would get the list, Virginia would call the city or the county or Bob at the housing authority and say, do you have any interest in these properties? That was about the best research we could do. All right, so you would go acquire the property, then you've got to wait 13 months for that title owner to be able to foreclose the right of redemption. So in that process, you've got to notify everybody that has potential interest in that property. And that's where Stephanie runs into issues with estates, with lenders, with any number of third parties that have interests that either can't be contracted, we don't know where they are, or she can't find them after a reasonable search, and then you can't get the right of redemption foreclosed. All right. If we can get the right of redemption foreclosed, and one thing that's not in these recommendations that I think we ought to do is when the property is first acquired at the tax sale, based on the information we have, we should then, as soon as that time period is over, or even before then, determine whether we're going to be able to foreclose the right of redemption timely. And if it can't be done, I would like to look at a circumstance of quit claiming the deed back to the tax commission. I don't know whether that can be done, but if we can't get the right of redemption foreclosed, send it back to the list of properties.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you.
Wait a minute. Okay, so, correct me if I'm wrong. What are you saying? Don't expand the land bank at this time to just hire us, for the city to just give you a person to get the properties off the.
So I don't have any problem with expanding the scope of the participants or the appointees on the land bank. Don't have any problem with that. I'm talking about the additional powers under the 2012 Act. Those powers are much more expansive than what we have now. The only thing I'm saying is get our property list now cleaned up before we start doing additional powers under the 2012 statute. You could probably go ahead and potentially say we're going to redo an agreement to the IGA to include that, but as a practical matter, we need to get what we've got resolved before we start doing expansive additional authority. And then hopefully by the time that expansive additional authority is legal and available, I will have retired.
One more question, I'm sorry. So, one more question. The properties that we do have right now that you were talking about, what is for the properties maintenance, like the expenses? I mean, what?
Holly, everything with maintenance ties into our inability to get the properties closed.
Oh, okay.
The land bank technically does not have title to that property until the right of redemption is foreclosed, which means technically that responsibility still rests on the original property owner. But yet the tax records will show land bank authority. All right, so then somebody calls up and they complain to the city about a condition on a land bank property that may not be our property yet. And we have an agreement with the city for maintenance, which is another cost that Jessica has that is not reflected in the budget of the executive director. And if we can get the properties closed and get them transferred, those issues go away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. That's good.
Mayor,
Yes, Mrs. Wyndham.
I did see it. There is no mechanism for property that you purchase at a tax sale to convey it back to the tax commissioner or the debtor in 5A if you just decide you don't want it anymore. The only mechanism for quit claiming that property back is if someone actually redeems it
based on your foreclosure of the right of redemption. Or they can redeem it anytime within that 12 months. The law is clear as to what they would have to pay to do that. My suggestion would be, and this is something that maybe could go into an interlocal agreement, or it could just be a part of land bank policies and procedures, would be to be slightly more strategic in what you're purchasing, and not just based on its location, but also based on the status of the title. We know what's going to be on the tax sale because it's published in the newspaper. Pick and choose, run title, know what you're purchasing before you actually get it, and then you don't run into these problems at the end, or at least you're prepared for them. Because we have, as Mr. Galloway said, we have properties with double estates. We have double tax sale properties where the right of redemption was never foreclosed the first time. The person that bought it at the tax sale the first time then didn't pay the taxes, and it was sold at a tax sale a second time. We have lots of those. So the issues are just compounded. We have IRS liens, Georgia Department of Revenue liens, Georgia Department of Labor liens, mortgages for mortgage companies that have been defunct since 2008. So there are so many issues.
So what I'm hearing is become like a dumping ground. And I mean, I just remember I was on staff when the whole idea when it was a new entity, but to focus, is it still relevant to say, I mean, that this was supposed to be for block revitalization, or to look at certain areas that needed, I mean, and now it's just, we're acquiring properties all over the county.
Well, and the reason that it is that quagmire is because for a while, the executive director was basically saying whatever's left over at the tax sale that no one bids on, the land bank will take it. That's not a strategy.
Right.
And so that's the reason. There's a reason nobody would bid on those properties.
Right. Anything else from the board? Okay. Thank you all for being here today. Moving into our final agenda item is to review comments regarding the resolution to adopt the 2023 calendar year tax millage rate at the rate of 7.083 mils. This is not a public hearing at this point.
It is,
So-
yeah, it's
so-
received comments.
Okay, so this is a public hearing, so we will receive comments after the presentation from Mrs. O'Connor.
Yes.
Thank you.
Last one. Okay, as we always try and do, is we give you the last 10 years of millage rates. I won't read them individually, but as you can see, they continually went down from 2012 until 2019, when we finally said we cannot cut the millage rate anymore unless we are cutting services. So at this point, we have been at 7.083 since 2019's tax year. Unfortunately, the legislature requires us to advertise this as a tax increase. I, in my very humble opinion, disagree with how that is worded. However, it has been advertised as a tax increase, was in the paper last Tuesday as was required, and will be in there again to be 7 days before the public hearings. We will have 3 public hearings, this being the first. We will have another one tonight at 6, and then the final one on the 13th at 6:01. With a vote that evening to adopt the resolution. Let me also apologize for how the paper worded the millage rate presentation. This is a discussion. You haven't recommended anything, but we went ahead and did 3 public hearings with my recommendation because that is required in order to get it adopted in time. We felt that it was time to go ahead and just put it on the agenda to discuss. So this is a discussion. You haven't recommended a word. But at this time, I am recommending that we keep the current millage rate. We will go through some of those figures as to why, and then have any questions or comments that you would like. The 2021 net digest was $651,786,950. This year's net digest is $725,797,312. As you can see, that is a large change. Reassessments and other digest changes in 21 was 33 million, and in 22 is 74 million. So the current millage rate is 7.083. The rollback rate, in order for us to collect the same amount of taxes as last year, is 6.258. What that means though is you are not taxing the other part of the digest. So that whatever was reassessed and valued at a higher property value this year would not be taxed if you took the rollback rate. So again, we are suggesting that we take the current millage rate of 7.083. Revenue budgeted for FY '23, if you will remember when we had our budget presentation, I told you that we had not yet accounted for any kind of millage rate discussion at that time. So we budgeted $4,248,250 for our property tax revenue for the general fund. And FY '22, we budgeted $4,204,500. So we did expect that it would go up a little bit. We did not know it would go up quite as much as it had. So at the rollback rate, you're going to collect even over what we budgeted. If you collect 100%, we don't collect 100%. We collect about 90% total. So if you look at 90% collections, you're at $4,087,836. We would already be short what we budgeted for property tax. If you go to the current rate at 100% collections, you would collect $5,140,822. Again, we do not collect 100% of property tax. We collect at about 90%. So you're looking at collections of approximately $4,626,740. You are $400,000 over budget at that point. So when you look at it that way, that's great news. You have collected 89.8% for last tax year, which gave you $4,144,008. If you collected that same amount, again, you're right at about $4.6 million. However, what everybody has experienced, the city has not been immune to. So I asked our directors the last couple of days for some numbers on just normal supplies, contracted labor, those kinds of things, so that you can see what we are already incurring in FY '23. Our equipment and supply costs for this building, we're doing some access control upgrades in this building. So when you come in that back door and you push like I want to do and you get jammed, it's because we're getting ready to put some badging systems on there. Unfortunately, from the time that we approved that to now, it has increased 18.3%. Our fire turnout gear for a firefighter to go into a burning building has increased 31.8% from last year to this year. Our police department boots have increased 27.3%. Filter cloths for water wastewater have increased 38.1%. And the most shocking to me, our transformers have increased 99.8% from 1 year. Labor costs, our overtime for the police department for last fiscal year increased 50.9%. I added that because of course we have so many vacancies within that department that we're having to use overtime. Our contracted polygraph testing from last year to this year increased 11.1%. Landfill analytics, which is a small number, but the percentage almost doubled, 41.6% for us to continue to monitor our methane wells, which is required by EPD at our landfill. Our senior engineer for transportation purposes increased 20.7%. And then one of our citywide goals that was adopted by both staff and the Board of Commissioners is our compensation study, which is not addressed at all in the budget or within these numbers that I just gave you as far as expenses. So I actually separated that out on a separate slide, and I want to reiterate that these are very preliminary figures. Even from what was put out publicly Friday to what is now in front of you today, it has changed. So this is to get the city to the minimum of the average. So we're still at the 50th percentile if we do this, which means half of our competitors are above us. But to get us to that minimum, this is what it's going to take. $1,365,584.36. Again, very preliminary, and we have it broken down. And I've changed it. I forgot to change branch. Branch actually is golf and parks. I have no idea why it is listed as branch. But you can see it for yourself. The electric utility needs about $187,000. That sort of takes care of itself because it's an independent enterprise fund, so we don't really have to look at that in regards to property tax revenue. However, if you look at property tax revenue, you look next at general fund, $253,180. Any of that overage that you just made, you just ate up. Water and wastewater, again, is sort of self-contained, it's its own utility. So they're $215,562. We do believe they can take care of it on their own. Solid waste, however, does not have any excess money. They do not have fund balance. Y'all have heard that every time we come to budget the last couple of years, that we are still trying to get them back in the black and get them caught up from past failures. So they're at 69,366, which we do feel like we would have to supplement from general fund potentially. Stormwater, again, can sort of take care of its own at 37,250. Branch, again, is golf and parks, which is at 14,955, which is always a transfer from the general fund, as well as the maintenance shop at 25,885. Airport is also a transfer that would be split between the city and the county at $8,927. Telecommunications is the most where it's supposed to be because it's our newest fund, so we sort of knew where they needed to be when it was established. There at 3,400. General F is the fire department. They right now are our most underpaid based on market study at 280,325. The police department is at 269,757. They will be much higher, except that we took care of some of that, about half, based on what we can tell with the first $3 an hour raise that we gave, not this past budget, but the year before. So right now, we have concerns, obviously. The general fund ones are the ones that are most direct reflective of what we do with the property tax rate. All of those numbers together are close to $1 million. So we budgeted, again, 4.248 for property tax. The expensive budgeted for our general fund is $35 million. So property tax really is a drop in the bucket to what we actually have to budget for revenue to be able to pay our expenses. Our services that we provide to our citizens are $24 million. The supplies needed to provide those services are 5.3, and other charges such as intergovernmental transfers and things of that nature are 5.6. The compensation study is not included in those expenses. You can add about $1 million in addition to what's budgeted for general fund to make that about 36 million, and that does not include benefits, which is 40%. So you're really looking at about 1.4 for the general fund that is needed for our compensation study. I can tell you at this time that if this is not adopted, we will have to change services. So fire will potentially have to close down trucks and not ride on trucks. The police department may have to unfund their vacant positions, which means we are cutting services from the police department. We will not respond to private property accidents. If we get a call that we think we can take on the phone with a records clerk, we will do so. This is dire. I hate to sound like it is dire, but I don't have another choice. I'll tell you that since the newspaper article and since our advertisement in the paper, I have been questioned mostly by my friends, so it's been somewhat okay to discuss, and they've been reasonable to talk with. And the question that has been most consistent is, why do you need more money if you can do the same thing for the same amount from last year? I can't. I don't have a special factory where I can go buy a car from the percentage that we purchased it in 1999. I can't even go back and buy a car for what we purchased one for last year. We budgeted, and you've seen it, we've come to you with amendments up to the agenda because what we bought and y'all approved at one meeting, 2 weeks later when we actually get it delivered, is $30,000 more. We can't keep up. So I'm at this point telling you that my recommendation is to not accept the rollback rate, keep the current millage rate as is, 7.083. I know that's a hard pill to swallow. I apologize for it, but we cannot continue to roll it back and continue to maintain the services that I believe our citizens need. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Connor. And just given reality, we reduced the millage rate 20%. We used to bring in over $5 million a year, and we dropped below $4 million. And we made a tough decision 2 years ago to not roll back the 0.24 the last 2 years, which equates on $250,000 home of $24 a year. This year equates to on $250,000 home of $82.50 of additional revenue if you did not get reassessed. So I appreciate the detail that you provided. Are there any comments or questions from the board, Ms. Murray?
Just repeat what you just said, the last figure you said, $84.
So on $250,000 home,
Okay.
on 0.825 equates to $82.50. So it means $250,000 or $125,000 would be $41.25. Any other questions from staff or from commissioners? This is a public hearing. At this time, is there anybody in the audience like to come before the board to ask questions, make comments? Public hearing. Is there anything else from board members? Is there anything else from staff? Mr. Conrad? Okay. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you, staff, for y'all's great work today. Mr. Jacobs, excellent presentation. We have a motion to adjourn from Mr. McCord to adjourn. Do we have a second? Ms. Murray with a second. All in favor? Say bye. Bye.